video is brought to you by HelloFresh. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time, and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1957, 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie? And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago. And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you. But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, no, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle. Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry. And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, this is our brother. And so they approached him and they said, look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother. And we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us. And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken and we can put this behind us. And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, you are Larry Bader. When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best. But as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson. He's on TV. Hey, Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that 1, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And 2, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is, they are not made. You are the chef, and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen's16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by, this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group. And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group. And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him, and very quickly they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted, and as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is going to be physically uncomfortable to listen to. And at the end of the story, I'm going to show you a video that is highly distressing. So viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please encourage the like button to join the official MrBallen Discord server, but secretly manipulate their account so that no matter how engaged they are on the server, they can't level up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of 3 named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes' drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called Berth Number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, This one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use berth number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of berth number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of berth number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then, once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else. Okay, so imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket, and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically that's what this habitat was. Korea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed, and so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on, he dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface, he talked to the folks on the boat, they handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat, and then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. This is not a normal ad. I am not trying to get you to buy anything. Instead, I want you, all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious, to join our Discord server. It's completely free. Really, totally free. And if you don't know what Discord is, don't worry. I learned about it like 2 months ago. It's a totally free to download app that allows communities to get together in one centralized place, and ours is awesome. Once you click on the Discord invite link in the description below, you'll be brought through a very simple onboarding process, and then boom, you're in. And if you have any issues along the way getting set up, we have incredible moderators and people in the community that are ready to help you. And then once you're all set up, just start participating. There's so much to do in there. There's all these different forums and voice chats. There's live digital campfire storytelling that members are self-organizing. I'm seriously on there all the time, happy to chat with you. And the more you engage with the server, the faster you level up. You come in at level 1 with certain privileges, and the top level is level 100. And along the way, each level offers real-life rewards that are specifically tailored to fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And I can promise you some of the upper level rewards are pretty good. Also, we will be using Discord as the place we go to drop announcements, whatever it is, whether it's a new event or a new product or anything to do with our universe, we're going to Discord first. And we have a lot of huge things planned over the next couple of years, and so it really benefits you to be in the know. And again, all you gotta do is join the server. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, click the Discord invite link below in the description, or click on any of the Discord invite links in my social media bios and join up, and then start participating and work your way towards level 100. But don't wait, because literally thousands of people are doing this, and we will always be able to tell who signed up early. It literally gets attached to your username, and we will likely begin rewarding people that joined the server early. So again, click the Discord invite link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe, and it also began sucking in seawater. Basically everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath, and so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200 foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking, they're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys were very badly battered at this point. I mean, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head. He felt scuba tanks, 2 of them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They'd get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further. But Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well, like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Paria Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You gotta go back down. You gotta save them. But ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface, but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe, because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Paria Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe. And so to finish this story, I'm going to show you the final footage taken by one of the divers, Kazim, who was the one who got the wrench and brought it back inside the habitat, handed it off, and then that wrench was used to push the lever, which created the vacuum. You'll see in this video that it looks like nothing is going on, and Kazim is just inside of this habitat and all the divers are fine, and then it's like his camera just turns black. What's happening there is he was pulled so quickly into the pipe that it looks like it was a cut of the camera, when in reality, that's just how fast everything inside of that habitat was pulled into the pipe. This video is highly distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please encourage the like button to join the official MrBallen Discord server. However, secretly manipulate their account so that no matter how engaged they are on the server, they can't level up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, to join our Discord server, or just see what's going on in the strange, dark, and mysterious community, be sure to check out our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Divine intervention is when a deity, so God or a god, becomes actively involved in human affairs here on Earth. Now, of course, we don't know if divine intervention is a real thing, but today's story certainly offers compelling evidence that it might be. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please use all your life savings to build this beautiful luxury home right on the coastline to be used as an Airbnb, and then finally, after years of work, when it's all done, tell the like button that they can stay in the Airbnb for the first time, they're the first guest, all for free, go enjoy it, but don't tell them about all the human-hating, highly aggressive honey badgers you've hid under all the beds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the evening of November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called the Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth, Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house, because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other 2 elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, "Hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here?" Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, "Leave me alone." I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other 2 maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, "You know what? I'm fine. I'll finish up. You go lay down. I hope you feel better." By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her nightclothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. I mean, after all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him. And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home and he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, "Hey, you should hire John." And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. I mean, Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. I mean, he just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want, no matter what. I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other 2 elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the 2 maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night, and then he made his way into the kitchen and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something, and Emma, she's upstairs and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic, and she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom and she couldn't see Emma anywhere, and her bed was totally on fire. And so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen, where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid, and the 4 of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread, and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the 4 of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the 4 of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all 4 of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head. John and Elizabeth and the 2 maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do. And then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all 4 of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house. And so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. Hey everybody, if you've not heard by now, our flagship podcast, MrBallen's Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, that pretty much immediately rocketed to the top of the charts when we launched in 2022, and then quickly was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the same year. Yeah, that show, our top show, is now available everywhere. It is no longer just on Amazon Music, it's on all platforms, and it's free. Which means if you've not listened to this podcast since it went exclusive with Amazon Music back in November of 2022, then that means you have about 100 new stories that are only on the podcast that are only now being made available to everybody. So go binge them. And if you signed up for Amazon Music just for this podcast, I love you. Thank you so much. But most importantly, there are still going to be perks for you if you continue to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music. Prime members will get to listen to the MrBallen's Podcast 30 days earlier than everybody else, and Prime members will get to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music with no ads. But again, the MrBallen's Podcast is now available worldwide on every podcast platform, and it's totally free. So please, if you would, go find the MrBallen's Podcast on your choice podcast platform, whether that's Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple or whatever. Give us a follow, listen to an episode, and then please rate the podcast and leave a review. It does an enormous amount for the growth of the show. I'd really appreciate it. All right, back to the stories. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him, but John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell and he led John down the hallway to this room, and when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table, and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was, but then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is, and it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templar, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down. And Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes, and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit, and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents, which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor, and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law. And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kind of acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters, like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, "Well, what did you have for breakfast today?" and "What's your favorite color?" And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not John was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, "Oh yeah, he's guilty, he killed Emma." And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever, and each time John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, "You know what? We cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment," and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today, we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby, the father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the Glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped, and he flew into this rage, and he began screaming back at Emma, and then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry, he pulled it off, and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head, and Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma, and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma, and if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone, and then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So, in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial, and so that's why as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. We don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trap door and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married, and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81. Hey everybody, as mentioned earlier, right now you can listen to over 100 news stories on the MrBallen's podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. It's available on all of them. And so right now, I'm going to play you a clip from an episode of the MrBallen's podcast. It's called Rendezvous in Capistrano. Enjoy. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door, but he went around to the driver's side and he saw right away the front window was smashed, and Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. If you like that trailer and you want to hear the whole story, just go ahead and look up the MrBallen podcast on any podcast platform. It's free. And then once you find it on Apple, Spotify, wherever, just give the show a follow and then start your binge. Or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the MrBallen podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Go follow, go listen. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, then you need to check out all the Ballin Studios podcasts. You can find all of those podcasts simply by searching for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform. Okay, that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. One afternoon in February of 2007, a very nervous man walked across an icy parking lot towards the front door of a police station in Merrillville, Indiana. This man had just been arrested, and he was being brought here to be processed. But he actually believed, or at least hoped, that he'd be allowed to leave really quickly, basically right away, because he actually had critical information about a 4-year-old murder case that he wanted to trade for his freedom. And even though he did feel nervous that it might not work, deep down he knew it would, because this was not just a small tip. This was a bombshell. But before we get into today's story, for anybody checking, today is a Friday, and you may be wondering, why am I getting a new story on a Friday? Well, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that you are now going to get 2, 3, up to 4 new MrBallen videos every week right here. And they'll drop on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and of course, Saturdays. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to the most expensive restaurant in town and tell them that you will cover the bill. But when the bill arrives, make sure you've snuck out the back door. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of April 17, 2003, 33-year-old John Parker Jr. sat at his desk in his office at J&J Parker Industries in Merrillville, Indiana. He was looking over some paperwork and hoping he would get at least a few minutes without any interruptions to finish reading it. Because in John's world, a few minutes were hard to find. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company dedicated to training people to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums were not glamorous, but his company was really successful, and running it was a lot of work. He was on his feet all day, managing about 25 employees and solving constant problems, and he usually did not get much quiet time to do things like paperwork. And even though John did complain about this, the truth was he actually loved being busy. He'd always been a very hard worker. He'd started in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman, and even though everyone told him there was no money in vacuums, he'd prove them wrong. He was so good at sales that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now he had a whole company that taught other people how to be great at it too. But now, as John tried to get through the paperwork, his desk phone rang. He sighed and he picked it up, and it was his wife, Judy. She told him that their daughter had left her homework in his office when she was there just the other day, and she asked him if he could bring it home with him. Now, John was about to tell his wife that this was now the second time she had reminded him about this homework, but he stopped himself because right now things were pretty good. Things between them were solid, and so he tried to remind himself that it was not worth messing that up. So John and Judy had been married for 10 years, and she was his partner in life and in business. They had raised 4 kids together, and Judy was actually the second J in J&J Parker Industries. John knew that to everyone else they looked like a happy, successful power couple, but the truth was much more complicated, because about a year ago, Judy had an affair. And this had devastated John at the time, but he really wanted to give their marriage another shot. They'd been living in Michigan at the time, and they agreed that moving the business to Maryville, Indiana, where John was from, would be a good way to start fresh. And so far, they both felt like it had been the right call. The business was doing really well, things were looking up, and most importantly, John and Judy were actually getting along. So now, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for repeatedly asking him about the homework, he just said, sure, and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up with Judy, he heard a knock on the door, and his office manager, Barry Jones, charged in holding more files. Barry dropped them on John's desk and said sorry, but he needed a signature. It was for the final termination paperwork for an employee John fired, whose name was Derek Hall. So a week earlier, John had made the very difficult decision to let Derek go. It wasn't personal. Derek just wasn't a good fit. He couldn't keep up with the sales quota. And John had really high standards for his employees. That's how he became a millionaire in the first place. But Derek somehow thought his firing was John's fault. And he'd actually showed up at J&J and made a scene in the parking lot saying that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. And when John tried to defuse things, Derek had physically attacked him. The police had to be called, and they separated John and Derek before it got too ugly. And John had ended up paying Derek what he wanted, since he just wanted the whole thing to be over, which was also why now he was immediately scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry, because hopefully now he would just never have to see or speak to Derek ever again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home, which was about 15 minutes away from the office. And when he got inside his house, he heard Judy call down from upstairs that she'd be ready soon. So he yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. And this was because just over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office, and they'd gone to a buffet together. So John really wasn't hungry at all anymore. But dinner with Judy was definitely more about spending time together than actually eating, so he wasn't going to say anything about the late lunch. John made his way into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. It was his 17-year-old daughter, Christina, her 15-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight so that he and Judy could go out. But when John tried to make conversation with them, Christina and Daniel gave him the cold shoulder. Now, to any other parent, this could be interpreted perhaps as just typical teenage behavior. But to John, it was more loaded than that. So Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their life since they were really little, and he considered himself to be their dad. And John had always tried to be very involved in things like coaching Daniel in baseball and going to school concerts and parent-teacher conferences. But his relationship with these kids had changed lately. And frankly, both of the kids had really begun acting out. Christina repeatedly threw parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone, while Daniel was combative and hung out with a group of friends who were seemingly always in trouble with the law. And this had created a lot of conflict between them and John, because he was the one who tried to discipline them, while Judy sort of always played the good cop. But John knew better than to try and force them to talk to him. So when he went in there, he just kept quiet and they all watched the TV until Judy came downstairs and said she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left their dinner, got in the car, and drove back to John's office at J&J Parker Industries, which was in an office park in a secluded area. And the 2 of them had had a really nice dinner. However, during their meal, Christina had called and wanted to know where that homework was that John was supposed to bring home. And John, very embarrassingly, suddenly realized that despite all those reminders from Judy that he was getting so annoyed by, he had forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, to pick up the homework on their way home. John parked the car in the lot, and both of them hopped out. When they got inside the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there working, which John expected. I mean, things had been busy lately with planning seminars and finding a new hire to replace Derek, and Barry was in charge of keeping it all organized. And John really didn't feel too bad that Barry was putting in so many hours. I mean, this was his job, and the company relied on him to ensure nothing major slipped through the cracks. So when Barry mentioned to John when he went inside that, he actually might be heading home soon, John said no. At the same time, John saw his wife grab the homework from his desk and then hustle out to the car, and as she disappeared, John told Barry that he was sorry, but Barry needed to stay and finish what he was doing. But then, to make up for delivering this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had basically a full meal since he had not been hungry. Barry sort of grumbled about it, but said he would take the food if he was offering, and so John nodded and went outside to grab it. Moments later, John arrived at the car, where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened up the back door, and he picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked back at him, he told her he was going back to give the food to Barry, and she just shrugged and said, fine, then turned back around. But right at that same moment, John heard the sound of footsteps in the concrete right behind him. But before he could turn around, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too, which was followed quickly by a second one, and she instinctively ducked down in her seat and then looked back at John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. And before she could do or say anything, she saw a masked person in dark clothes crouch over John for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car towards the main road. Judy leapt out of the car and ran to John, yelling his name, but he just lay there on the pavement, not moving. And then she saw this huge pool of blood forming right underneath his head. With her heart racing, Judy ran to the office door and screamed at Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was overrun with officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was Detective Donald Toth, who had been with the Maryville Police Department for the last 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only known that there was a shooting. But when he arrived on the scene, a first responder told him that there'd actually been a fatality. 33-year-old John Parker Jr., who had been identified by two witnesses at the scene. The first responder also explained that when they got there, before they spoke to the witnesses, they had looked for John's wallet to identify him, but the wallet had not been in his pockets or in the car. And when Toth heard that, his first thought was that maybe this was a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a look at John, he immediately revised that theory. John was on his back behind a parked car, and the first thing Toth noticed was that he had a lot of nice jewelry on. Gold and diamond rings, a bracelet, and an expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was not close to anything, and it just didn't feel like the kind of place a random mugger would go looking for victims. Toth wondered if the killer took the wallet just to make police believe this could be a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely an efficient, planned execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, and when Toth used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw a gunshot wound right behind his ear. Toth had actually been a paramedic before becoming a detective, so he knew that shot had likely killed John instantly. It also meant John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food and some car keys on the ground right next to John's body, and their placement made it feel like John might have been holding them when he fell. If John had an altercation, like with a thief or somebody who killed him in the heat of the moment, the scene would be way messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had just walked up to John while he was busy with something at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then after he died, grabbed John's wallet and then left. Which also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth saw were just two shell casings, and he doubted there would be footprints or DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they'd already done a sweep of the office park, and they'd looked in dumpsters and bushes and on the roofs of all the buildings, but they hadn't found anything, and they didn't see any cameras or surveillance in the area. So, as Toth stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched his officers continue to search the scene, he realized he was the lead on a case with virtually no forensic evidence, which might have been daunting, but he did have at least two witnesses. About an hour later, Toth sat down across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside of an interrogation room inside the Maryville police station. He'd learned a few things about Judy already. She'd been the one who told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that, as the spouse of the murder victim, she was his best suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the actual shooter, but considering how pristine the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a hit, done by a professional, and Judy maybe could have hired them. But as Toth spoke to Judy, he started to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying, which made it hard for her to get her words out, and when she did speak, it was slow, like it was taking her a lot of effort to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth a timeline, how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date, and then stopped over at the office after, since one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been there, and that when she had gone back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were speaking. And then at some point, John, he left the building and came out to get his dinner leftovers, and at that time, she had turned away from him, and then she heard these two loud shots. And then when she turned back around, she saw John fall, and then also there was this figure in dark clothes who was sort of bending down on top of John, and then they ran away. However, when Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something changed in her demeanor. The shakiness in her voice and all the grief that was sort of pouring out of her to this point, it vanished. And in its place, Judy became very hardened, and she looked right at Toth, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw this, he almost got goosebumps from it because it was such a quick departure from what had been going on. And he thought to himself, either she is a great actress and this is all a big facade and she did it or she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who doesn't know what to make of the fact that her husband has just been killed. At some point, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anybody who might have wanted to hurt John. And Judy appeared to think for a second, but eventually she just said no. She said that John was an incredible husband and father, and they had a great marriage that they had really worked hard on, and everybody at work respected him. But then something clearly occurred to Judy, because she frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. And after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled employee was definitely somebody that he should be speaking to. And Toth was speaking to the office manager, Barry Jones, right after this, and so he figured he could ask him about that incident too. Now, Toth wasn't ready to rule Judy out as a suspect, since he still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about her marriage. But for now, he didn't see a reason to hold her. So he told Judy that for now, she was welcome to go home and be with her kids and grieve, and they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee of J&J Parker Industries that John Parker had recently fired. Last night, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones, who had confirmed what John's wife Judy had said about Derek, that after he was fired, there had been this huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and Derek was the instigator. It was the only useful information Barry had given him, since he said, during the shooting, he had actually been in the bathroom, and so he hadn't heard or seen anything until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was enough. And the other thing was, Barry and Judy were not the only ones who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before this, Toth also spoke to John's brother, David, who was incredibly devastated and furious about his brother's death, and David had also pointed the finger at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet Derek, a man 3 people claimed could be a killer. Toth got to the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. And when Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed stunned, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in the living room, and even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there, because he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek said that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he'd expected, and when he couldn't keep up with it, he was fired. And then, John shorted him $400 on his final paycheck, so he had gone to J&J to get the money he was owed.
Now, he admitted that it did lead to a physical fight, but he said they'd only pushed each other, and it ended up getting resolved, like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted he could not have killed John because he'd actually spent the whole evening last night at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth the friend's number and said, "Go ahead, call him, he'll confirm it." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he took down this number. But if the alibi checked out, he could rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was possible that Derek had, actually taken a hit out on John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem likely that he would have the excess cash to pay anybody to go commit a murder. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back in his car, he decided the interview was not a total bust after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize he needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John got rich young and built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, those kinds of people often stepped on others to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct towards an interrogation room. He had confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects for now. Which was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his former witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. Yesterday, Toth had gone to the J&J Parker Industries office and made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And he found out that John was a great boss who pushed his employees, but he worked hard himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company, and the Parkers as a duo were well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But office gossip also said their marriage was not exactly happy, and it was sort of common knowledge that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned this the first time Toth had spoken to them, so now Toth had no idea if anything they had said to him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom and was actually, the shooter. Or he and Judy were maybe working together and they were both lying. Toth was leaning towards the second option because he had also found out that Judy was going to get a big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And aside from that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe, he thought, she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth went into the interrogation room, he intended on essentially saying that the investigation was over. They'd caught Barry in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like somebody who was guilty and cornered. He was charismatic and confident, and he said the affair was total office gossip. He was just good friends with Judy, and they worked together closely. Barry said he and Judy and John were like family. In fact, he said he was living with one of Judy's cousins from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe what Barry was saying, but even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth just had to let him go. Because without any evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that was not enough to prove they also conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, so 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk, rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before approaching Judy about it. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything, and he didn't really have any other leads, aside from learning that the shell casings found on the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. Which was useful to know, but it wasn't going to help him with his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been full speed ahead on this case since Thursday night, and he was exhausted. He was starting to consider maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was somebody on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone, and the person on the other end of the line explained they were a police officer as well from a nearby town, and they said that they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information. So about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search on their kids and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was payment for a hit on John Parker. Now, that stunned Toth, but not nearly as much as what the officer said next. These 2 kids said the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. And Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing because Daniel Hicks was John's own 15-year-old stepson. Toth had really begun to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it did not occur to him that this hit could be linked to family and also a child. Now, the officer on the phone explained that they really hadn't taken this very seriously at the time, so no one had notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Which, Toth did not have to point out here, but this was a huge screw-up. But he wasn't focused on, the right and wrong of it. He was just focused on figuring out what happened. And so Toth got the names of these 2 kids with the cash from the officer, and when he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track these kids down. Then Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son, Daniel, in for an interview, and since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come too. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside of an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting at the back of the room, watching while her son Daniel sat at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her child apparently asked somebody to kill John. She told Toth there had to be a mistake here, and she was happy for police to speak to Daniel directly because that would allow them to clear this all up. Toth had decided not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment because she was being very cooperative, letting them speak to her son, and he also just didn't want to upset her and have her change her mind. They also had not been able to find those 2 kids that Daniel supposedly hired, and so right now, Daniel was the only one he could speak to. And so now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He seemed nervous, and he was blinking a lot, and he kept rearranging his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. And so Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So right off the bat, he told Daniel he knew about the murder for hire, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a big breath and then said it was true. He had actually paid 2 friends some money he had saved from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. John was always on his case and yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel said he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to, teach John a lesson and beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth here, and the 2 kids in the detention center either lied or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched, because why would these kids lie to get themselves in more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying, and Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then Toth called some officers in to make the arrest, and as he left the room, you could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked behind him. Now, at this point, even though Toth had been up all night and he was totally exhausted, at the same time, he actually felt far more alert than he did even in the couple days before, because now it felt like they really were, making movement on this case. And so instead of trying to get some rest back at his house, he went back to his office, poured some coffee, and kept on working. On May 15th, 2003, so almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk reading some copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that police were looking for information about John Parker's murder in Maryville, and it offered a reward to anybody who came forward. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town tomorrow to see if the public could maybe give him a new lead. It was sort of an act of desperation, because while this case had seemed close a couple times to being wrapped up, just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead. It had taken police a while, but they had finally found both of those kids from the detention center that Daniel apparently hired to, rough up his dad, who ultimately apparently killed him. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and accepting the money. But it turned out there was just no way they were actually the murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas when John was killed, and the other had been in detention at a juvenile facility. And so since Toth could not prove the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent here. Those two kids had said that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that. And Toth didn't think someone who wanted to kill his father had just stopped wanting to kill his dad all of a sudden. But since Toth knew Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings during the time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely gotten somebody else to do it. But Toth couldn't just keep talking to Daniel, because Judy had gotten a lawyer, and they were now not letting Toth question the family members at all anymore, which was very frustrating, since Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone, she benefited the most from John's death because she was a beneficiary on his life insurance. And she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry, and so maybe part of her motive could have been just to hide the affair from him. And then also Barry. He's potentially having this affair with Judy, John's wife. He might have a motive as well to get rid of John, to just keep this thing a secret. Also, he definitely seemed to think that John was, a pretty tough boss, and so maybe he just had had enough, and he was complicit or actively involved in getting rid of John. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's version of events. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired somebody to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool further. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because as of this week, he was also considering John's brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because John's brother David had stopped by her house and gotten into a verbal fight with the family. And this was not the first time this had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could mean David was just lashing out because he was grieving, but it also could mean he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet, and he knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have guessed that John would check in at the office after they were done eating, since he was a famously hard worker. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at this flyer. His brain was fried, but he felt hopeful these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to break this case. And so the next day, Toth and some other officers passed these flyers out. But then weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over files for something he missed, or maybe a witness they didn't interview, or evidence they'd maybe overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. "4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. Now, he had not forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was not actively investigating it at this point. In fact, all his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations, and they had realized this man had some crossover with one of Toth's homicides from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped in his tracks and immediately told this officer to go get him an interview. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man who was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker, and they had admitted to him that they were directly involved in his death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair, feeling both relieved and also disturbed. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was, and he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of April 17th, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance, with Judy sitting inside of it. But she was not the killer's target. John was. And John was also near the car. He was not inside of it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. It was open, and he was rifling around, inside the car, looking for something. And as the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were going to do next, they thought about John, who this man was, and how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell. And now, the killer was going to get retribution. So, while John continued to have his back turned, the killer silently walked up right behind him. They raised their gun, aimed at the back of his head, and they fired. And it was a direct hit that hit him right behind the ear, and John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, they just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were kind of jostled back into reality when they heard John's wife, Judy, yelling out and screaming. And so quick as can be, the killer grabbed John's wallet, so the police would think this was maybe a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived, and they gave them a hug and said they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer wore during the murder, and told the killer they were disposing of them. And the killer just listened, feeling very relieved. He trusted the mastermind more than anybody else in the whole world, because, after all, she was his mother. It would turn out Judy had convinced her own 15-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. And so with his death, she could get the whole thing. Now, she had actually already tried to kill John, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him, but when that didn't work, she had hired a hitman herself. But that also failed. So finally, she asked Daniel to help by promising that he would get some of the money. And she had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun to kill John with. Daniel actually tried to hire somebody else for the job, but then ultimately just did it himself and used his younger siblings for an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting. And the man who told all this to the police was Christina's husband, who she married 2 years after John's death. And once her husband gave authorities the whole story, police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison, while Daniel got 23 years in prison. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released in 2017, and Judy was released in 2022. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions inside the woods of North America. I'm talking about people being right in front of someone and then in a second they're gone and they're never found again. Or somebody goes missing and then they're found again, but in a location that's impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Politis has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 of his cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these stand out as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a hot pocket, but don't let it stand in the microwave for 2 minutes. Instead, serve it to them immediately so that when they bite into it, they are met with the tongue-scalding cheese lava flow within. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the evening hours of January 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by 2 people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed, and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old, it was March of 2013, and he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was going to go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly, but even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin, where he said he's lost on this mountain, and even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her, and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road, and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees, and he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road. He wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape. And in theory, he would have known where he parked it. Or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent." Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone, and she raises it up, and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened. And it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing. And as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him. And so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a hot pocket, but instead of letting it stand in the microwave for 2 minutes, serve it immediately so when they bite down, they're met with the tongue-scalding cheese lava flow within. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On February 24th, 2019, a woman arrived at a ceramics factory in Hubei province in China. She walked through the front door into the main office where she saw a desk attendant. She informed them she was a quality control inspector and she was there that day to inspect their vehicles. The attendant was accustomed to their company being periodically inspected, and so she asked the woman if she needed any help, and the woman said, "Nope, I'm just going to roam around your building, check what I need to check, and then I'll be out of here." And so the attendant told her that was totally fine, and if she needed anything, just come back and she would help her. And so the inspector thanked her and then turned around and went out the front door and checked the vehicles in the front lot of the ceramics factory. And then after she was done, she went back into the main office. She walked past the attendant and out the back door into the very active yard where all day long these huge bulldozers would move around thousands of pounds of sand. And so the inspector walked out that back door and she scanned the yard and she saw there were 2 bulldozers doing just that, moving all around. And then off to the left side, there was a dump truck that seemed to be stationary. And so very confidently, she just walked right into the yard and made her way over to that dump truck. And then when she got there, she flagged the driver down and said she was an inspector and that she was going to check the vehicle out. And so the driver helped her by turning on and off signals and moving back and forth. And then at some point, the inspector needed the dump truck driver to back up a significant distance. She needed to watch him do that. And so she, the inspector, backed away from the dump truck until she was in the middle of the yard, standing right in front of this parked bulldozer. What happens next is all caught on video. And so as she's standing there and she's watching the dump truck back up right in front of her, the bulldozer driver right behind her turns on the machine and immediately lurches forward. Now, the driver of this bulldozer did not see the woman, and she was in his blind spot right in front of the bucket of his bulldozer. And he was not aware there was somebody on foot walking around the yard. It's an extremely dangerous place to be on foot. And so he goes right into her and he knocks her backwards. She falls into the bucket. She starts screaming, but no one can hear her. It's so loud. And the driver drives the bucket directly into a pile of sand and scoops up thousands of pounds of sand that come down directly on this woman. So now she's completely buried alive and being crushed by all this sand. And then the driver, completely oblivious, lifts the bucket up, turns around and drives across the yard and dumps the sand and the woman into a vibrating sand crusher. The vibrating sand crusher is exactly what it sounds like. It pulverizes bits of rock and stone and grinds them down into a very fine powder. The machines come in various shapes and sizes, but this one inside of this ceramics factory was a top-loaded version, and it basically looked like a big dumpster with this big opening at the top. And so these bulldozer drivers would take these clumps of sand and they would dump it in this opening at the top of this bin. And then once they dumped their sand into the opening, the machine would vibrate, causing the sand to filter its way down towards the bottom of the machine, where there were these big, vicious metal claws that constantly smashed together and would just completely obliterate anything that passed through them. In the video, when the driver dumps his bucket load into the sand crusher, you can actually see the woman falling in, but then she immediately jumps into action and begins trying to pull herself up and out of this pile. And at some point, she gets most of her upper body out and she waves and she gets the attention of the driver who's just dumped her into the sand crusher. And the driver, he stops right away. You can see the vehicle lurch to a stop. He leaps out and he starts running over to the sand crusher. But as he's running over, this woman who's waving and waving, at some point her leg or some other part of her gets grabbed by those jaws at the bottom of the machine, and she's pulled slowly down into the sand crusher and disappears under the sand. When this happens, the driver is frantic and he's screaming for other people in the factory to come over and help. And at some point, the others inside, they realize there's an emergency and they all run over. But when they realize what's happened, that someone has fallen into the sand crusher, they all just stop and stand there because they know there's nothing they can do. The woman was gone. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School, and ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults. And a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas. They spent a lot of time outside and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer, since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer, to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking, and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill, they paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and looped-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them? And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride, they're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Park was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Park is still open for business and the Raptor ride is still operational. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left. But that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true. It was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and co-workers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now at the top of this duct where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through, but when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack unless he could get back up to the duct, but there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. On a summer night in 2020, a young man received a notification on his cell phone. When he read it, he realized his life was over. But before we get into his story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to buy the like button and order of their favorite food, fried chicken, but before you give it to them, remove the outer crispy layer from every piece. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the spring of 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was really kicking into high gear, students at the University of Nebraska were told to move out of their dorms and move back home with their families to prevent the spread of the virus. One student, 20-year-old Alex Kearns, who was enrolled at Nebraska on an ROTC scholarship, was just as shocked as everybody else at how quickly this pandemic had turned their life upside down. But in terms of going back home again, he wasn't that upset about it because he was close with his family and he figured some unexpected time with them would be nice. Once he got back to his hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is an affluent suburb outside of Chicago, he quickly fell into a quarantine routine, which consisted mostly of screen time and lounging around. But in the evenings, he would put his screens away and he would go into the kitchen with his mother, Dorothy, and the two of them would chat for hours about all sorts of things. One night, he told his mom that he was feeling kind of nervous about what he was going to do with his life after college, that even though he was studying business out at the University of Nebraska, he didn't really know what he was going to do with that. All he knew was that he wanted to find a way to help people. And his mother and everybody that knew Alex would say that that's just Alex. He was this really gentle, nice, awesome person that everybody just adored. After being home for a few weeks, Alex was starting to get bored of his quarantine routine, and he began looking for other things to do. He had seen a number of ads for a new brokerage app called Robinhood that was becoming increasingly popular amongst people his age. Unlike other trading platforms, Robinhood was designed for the common person. There was not huge fees that needed to be paid by the investor as soon as they logged on, and the app was very sleek, and it turned trading kind of into a game on the app. Alex had a few $1,000s in his bank account, and so he figured, you know what the heck, I'll download Robinhood and see what I can do. What's the worst that can happen? After trading on Robinhood for a couple of days, Alex was hooked, and he showed his family that he was actually making a little bit of money, and he was learning about the stock market. His parents would later recall when they found out he was using Robinhood, they weren't concerned because Alex had always been incredibly careful with his money, saving most of it and very rarely spending much of it, and so they figured, he might lose his savings, but he's certainly not going to fall into significant debt. That's just not Alex. Also, there was a safety mechanism in basic accounts on Robinhood that protected first-time users from going above $10,000 in debt. So even if Alex tried to lose more than that, the app wouldn't allow him so long as he was using a basic account. As the weeks went on, Alex got more and more confident in his trading ability, and he got really familiar with the Robinhood app. And one day he noticed there was one function he had not tried on the app called options trading. For context, traditional trading goes like this. Somebody identifies a stock that they like, and then they gamble on it. And the way they gamble on it is they buy shares of that stock, and if the stock increases in value, they make more money. If the stock loses value, they lose money. Very simple. But some people either can't afford the shares or don't want to buy the shares, but they still want to get in on the action of the stock market. And for those people, they can use something called options trading. Instead of buying shares, options traders will basically sell an insurance policy to other traders who have already purchased shares. And this insurance policy they're offering is known as an option. These option traders will go up to these shareholders and they'll say, for example, I'll give you $500 in exchange if your stock tanks and you're losing a ton of money. You can exercise your option, i.e. cash in your insurance policy, and I, the option holder, will cover all of your losses. But if your stock stays steady or gains in value, I still get to keep your $500. That's non-refundable. Naturally, these options traders, they need to be savvy about which stocks they're prepared to cover with their option. Because if that stock tanks and the shareholder decides to sell, i.e. exercise their option, then the option holder is obligated to immediately buy all of the shares at a premium. And if that shareholder has, let's say, hundreds of thousands of shares, well, too bad, the option holder is buying all of them. So when Alex clicked on the options trading button inside of his Robinhood app, it brought him immediately to an application because Robinhood had to make sure anybody on their app that was going to be buying or selling options, they needed to be an experienced trader and they needed to understand the risks because they were much higher than a basic account. There was no limit to how much debt someone could fall into in trading options. Alex was a smart guy and a motivated trader, but he knew nothing about options trading. And so when he saw this application, I'm sure he thought to himself, yeah, I know nothing about options trading. There's no way I could possibly get into this. But he decided, what the heck? I will apply to go on to their options trading side just to see if they'll accept me. And so he fills out the application and almost immediately he is accepted onto that side of the platform. It would later turn out that application was kind of a sham. It did not really do very much to restrict access to that side. Alex was surprised at his acceptance, but he was also very excited. And right away, he started trading options, and he was pretty good at it. And pretty quickly, he was making a little bit of money. But then on June 11th, he got a notification on his phone from Robinhood. And so he pulled his phone up, he opened the app, and he saw his account was restricted. He couldn't make any new trades, and he couldn't make any withdrawals. And so as he looked at it, he scrolled down to the bottom of the page, and he saw his current balance, and it read negative $730,000. A trader that Alex had sold an option to was exercising his option because his stock had tanked, and he owned over $700,000 worth of shares that now Alex was obligated to buy. Alex couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he immediately fired off an email to Robinhood customer support saying there had to have been a mistake, that he had done the math before he had sold that option, and he thought at most he was exposed to losing maybe $10,000, certainly not $700,000. And so after he sent this email, a couple of minutes later, he got a message back from Robinhood, but it was just an automated response that just said, hey, we got your email and we're busy and we'll be sure to be in touch with you as soon as we possibly can. And so at this point, Alex is starting to panic a little bit because he's looking at his phone and this looks real. He's trying to go through his phone to find some place that would show him this was a mistake, but there's nothing that indicates this is a mistake. And so after a couple of hours, Alex is just laying in his bed. He can't sleep, and he sends another message to the customer support team at Robinhood, pleading with them to please check his account. There has to have been a mistake. There's no way I would have exposed myself to $700,000 of debt. But again, all he gets is an automated response that says, we're busy and we'll be in touch with you soon. A couple hours later at 3:26 a.m., Alex is still awake, probably pacing around his room, totally panic-stricken. And he looks at his phone and there's another email from Robinhood. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, thank you. Someone's gotten in touch with me to tell me this has been a horrible mistake. And so he opens his email and the header of the email is immediate action required. And what it was a notice for him to make his first payment on this enormous debt. It was going to be about $170,000 that he had to pay in the next couple of days. And if he didn't make this first payment, they would seek legal action against him. Alex was probably terrified, and also he was ashamed and didn't want to tell his parents. And so all alone in his room, he writes a third email to Robinhood, now straight up begging them, someone please look at my account. This has got to be wrong. But again, he just got the automated message. And so for the rest of the night, Alex probably laid on his bed thinking the world was just crashing in on him. He knew there was no way he could pay this enormous bill, and if he didn't pay it, he would either go to jail or hand it off to his family, which would financially ruin them. And just the idea of doing that to the people he loved made him sick. He just could not face that as one of his options. And so by the time the sun came up the next morning, Alex had come to a conclusion about what he was going to do. He started by pulling out his phone and pulling up the Robinhood app and screenshotting the dashboard that showed his enormous negative balance. And then he went on his laptop and he wrote a long letter to his family and he put it on his desktop so they would understand why he did what he was about to do. And then he left the house, hopped on his bike, and pedaled away. A couple hours later, a police officer arrived at the Kearns' household and he told them that their son, their brother, Alex, was unfortunately deceased. He had thrown himself in front of a train. The family was beyond devastated. This caught them so completely off guard. It didn't make any sense. Alex was a happy, funny guy with plans for the future. He had shown no indications that he wanted to harm himself. It really just didn't make any sense. And so at some point that day, they went to his laptop, they opened it up, and there was that note he wrote. And in this letter, he explains to his family how he had fallen into this enormous debt on Robinhood. He attaches the screenshot that showed his huge negative balance. And he said it was just crazy that this company would allow a 20-year-old with no income to be exposed to over $700,000 of debt. He thought that was crazy, but he admitted he didn't know that much about options trading and probably shouldn't have been accepted into their program to begin with. And then he tells his family that he did want to live, but unfortunately, this was the only way he could get out of this problem without inflicting enormous financial penalties on his family. And so he believed he was protecting his family when he took his life. 24 hours later, Robinhood sent Alex another email and it said, oh, that $730,000 debt that we said you owed, that was a mistake. You don't owe anybody any money. Alex's family has since filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Robinhood, saying that had they just had a person working their customer service desk, they could have talked to Alex and immediately seen that this was a mistake, and it would have saved Alex's life. Their case is still ongoing. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the like button in order of their favorite food, fried chicken. But before you give it to them, remove the outer crispy layer from all of the pieces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
One day in the spring of 2006, a detective stood next to a refrigerator in her police station holding a container of evidence. She knew that what she was about to do with this evidence was a breach of protocol and could definitely get her in a lot of trouble. But that was not going to stop her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry. But just fold all their dirty clothes and give it back to them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush and told her to come back in 6 months. Then he headed into his back office to pack up. Once he'd gathered up all his things, he walked out through the reception area and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved and gave John a big smile. However, as soon as John actually left the building, the smile faded from his face. Because in reality, he had a lot of problems right now, and pretending to be happy all day was actually really exhausting. And so John walked across the lot, climbed into his car, and then began the half-mile drive from his dental practice to his house. So John had actually grown up in Blairsville, and it had been his lifelong dream to raise a family here. So when he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and very likely made a higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he joined the practice of his own childhood dentist right in downtown Blairsville. And it would actually turn out that John was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. This dental practice really took off, in part because John himself was really charming and great with kids, and so lots of families wanted to come here. And so what John had done is with the extra money he was making, basically above and beyond what he expected, he took that extra money and invested it into real estate and became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. However, it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that he really felt like he had made it in life. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children, and to John, this was actually perfect, because it meant that she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were sort of worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when John's mom got sick with cancer, Michelle took on the responsibility of being her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof that he ever needed that Michelle truly cared for him. And so the pair got married in 1997, and they actually adopted a little boy named JJ shortly after their marriage. And so altogether, they had 3 children. And together, this new big family moved into this big house with a pool and a hot tub. It was like everything was perfect. However, now, as John arrived back home and pulled into the driveway of his very modest home, and he sat there just staring at this new place he was currently living, he just thought to himself, like, how had everything fallen apart so completely? These days, John was very tight on money. He'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people because he was quite generous, but now he was having to ask for it back because he literally needed the money. And then on the marriage side, he and Michelle had hit this horrible rough patch that just didn't end. And they both admitted they had had affairs, and so now they were living separately, which was why John was here at this little house instead of coming home to the big family house with the pool and the hot tub. However, the financial stress and the marital stress, as bad as they were not nearly as bad as a third stressor in John's life. And that was that John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. Now, this all started 2 weeks earlier when somebody vandalized John's car with spray paint. And the police looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And, objectively, having your car spray painted, vandalized in some way does not, therefore mean someone's trying to kill you. But he just had this feeling that this felt really personal, like somebody was targeting him. And so eventually, over several days, John went from my car got vandalized to my car got vandalized and it makes me feel like someone's trying to kill me. And John believed this so completely that he actually went to his attorney and gave her $10,000 just in case he wound up dead. She could use that to investigate his murder. Now, John got out of his car and he walked up his porch steps and into his home and he closed the door and locked it behind him. And right away, John just felt like this house, it's already so depressing, but it was so quiet because nobody was here. I mean, he wished his adopted son JJ was here because he would have made the whole house just feel alive. But, these days, John didn't see JJ very much. He would go long stretches between visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room, and there on the coffee table, he saw a legal document that he had been avoiding. That document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, in 2003. But she and John had not been able to actually come to an agreement. Now, to be clear, they were not fighting to save the marriage. The marriage was done. Michelle was actually already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. However, what John and Michelle had been fighting over, which had caused this divorce to drag on, was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, but John didn't want to give up his son. However, John knew in less than 24 hours, this would all finally be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had already signed the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so John took a seat on the couch and turned on the TV. But he couldn't even focus, he was just too restless. So instead, he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce and about the custody agreement. And then eventually, when they said their goodbyes, John hung up, he stretched out on the couch, and he fell asleep right there. The next day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Use, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, could come out and play. He wasn't sure if JJ would actually be around, since JJ did split time between his mother and his father's place, but, he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach reached the front steps to John and JJ's house, he stopped, because he saw there was this little glass panel to the left of the front door that had been broken, shattered. There was glass on the porch. And also, Zach could see streaks of what looked like red liquid that had dried underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He sees this and thinks it's blood. He wants to turn and run away. But he thought about his friend JJ, and he was worried that maybe he was in some kind of trouble, so he couldn't just abandon him. And so, sort of mustering all the courage he could, Zach slowly and very nervously climbed the rest of the steps to the front door, and he tried the doorknob, but he found the door was locked. And so as carefully as he could, Zach actually reached his hand through that broken panel to the left of the door, being careful not to cut himself, and he reached inside the house and unlocked the door from the inside, and then he opened it up. And as soon as he stepped into the house, he saw there were papers strewn everywhere, and there was a body laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 children when she got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a bit confusing. Dispatch just said there had been a cardiac arrest and that Corporal Leidick was needed at the scene. There was no other information available. So, thinking the call was sort of a run-of-the-mill heart attack, Leidig, with her family, just drove straight over there. However, when she actually pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she could tell that this was not a heart attack. She saw there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Leidig walked over to him, and he immediately pointed out that broken glass and the blood that, appeared to be stained to the ground. And so she asked him, what's going on here? I was told this was a cardiac arrest. And all he said was, it's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself. So Leidig, she turned and waved to her husband and kids, sort of signaling everything's fine, just give me a minute. And then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was sort of struck by what she saw. I mean, the whole foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls. And there, in the center of it, amongst, all these papers strewn about, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen. Now, Leidig had never actually worked a homicide before, but she knew, as she tried and failed to count the number of stab wounds on this man's body, that what she was looking at here was definitely not cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup because, this call had been recorded erroneously as a cardiac arrest, but what that meant is the police had not sent a full emergency response. And so Leidig and this other patrol officer were the only people on scene. Leidig was afraid the killer or killers could still be in the area, or maybe even in this house. They hadn't even secured the house yet. And she's thinking she brought her kids and her husband with her. So she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house, and then she went back out into the front yard to basically stand guard between the murder scene and her family with her hand on the gun in her holster. Luckily, though, it wasn't long before Leidig heard a bunch of emergency sirens approaching in the distance. Also, at the same time, that patrol officer came out of the house to tell Leidig that it was empty. So the killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery this officer had made was he had found a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim had bled through from the floor above. And so at this point, Leidig said bye to her husband and her kids, and she sent them home. And then she went back into detective mode and went back inside the house. It was around this point that somebody on scene told Leidig what the victim's name was. They said his name was John Yelnick. And so as the crime scene technicians began their work processing the physical evidence inside the house, Leidig began a slow walk through each of the rooms inside the home, trying to get a sense of who John was, and also how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been very long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also strewn with divorce papers. John's body was also found barefoot. However, there were bloody shoe prints in the house, and these prints were far too big to belong to that little boy who found the body, Zach. So Leidig figured they must belong to the killer or killers. And so the crime scene techs were already measuring the prints to try to determine the killer's shoe size. As Leidig continued walking through the house, she didn't see anything that at least overtly looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The TV hadn't been taken, no drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and so on. And to Leidig, this actually made sense. I mean, the murder appeared to be extremely violent and so very likely quite personal, which suggested that whoever the killer was, or killers, the only thing they had really wanted when they entered this home was, apparently, for John to die horribly. She finished her sweep of the scene, ending up in the living room where it looked to her like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table, right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and note were from somebody named Melissa Use. And when Leidig saw that, she did a double take. Use was the last name of the neighborhood boy, Zach, who had discovered John's body. And so Leidig wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, the boy. And so now Corporal Leidig realized that here on the coffee table, she had her first two legitimate leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a divorce. And someone, maybe his next door neighbor, if Melissa was connected to Zach, owed him a lot of money that apparently she couldn't quite afford to pay back in one go, that she had to tell John to don't cash this right away. It was evening by the time Leidick finally stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw there was a group of neighbors and reporters jostling around each other out on the street. So Blairsville almost never had murders, and so Leidick knew this was obviously going to be a huge story. But for now, as much as she knew she was going to get hounded by reporters as she passed by them, she just needed to keep on walking because she had to get back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow, like with suspects. However, before she could even walk down the front steps, one of the other officers on scene came over to her with an update. Over the last few hours, the police had fanned out across the neighborhood to speak to people to see if anybody had seen or heard anything unusual. And the police had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, so technically early that same morning, she had woken up to the sound of a scream. And so she sat up, she heard the scream, but she said the screaming didn't continue, and so she had ultimately just gone back to bed. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time the previous night. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling in what sounded like a very heated argument. Now, the neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." And so instantly, when Leidick heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. Like, this seems to add more credibility to the idea that maybe money was behind this. However, the officer said he wasn't done. He said he had one more important piece of information for Leidick. In addition to the witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really ought to look into. And that was the Use family. Because word around the neighborhood was that Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Leidick was at the police station, sitting at a table inside of an interrogation room across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Now again, Leidick had never done a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for interrogating her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though they were not her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife Michelle and her new boyfriend Kevin, for the simple reason that in a murder case, from what she'd been told, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Leidick had sent an officer to tell Michelle that her soon-to-be ex-husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, she already knew, although she said that she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So this officer had to break the news to Michelle and also her new boyfriend Kevin that this was actually a murder, and they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Leidick actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin personally because he was a state police trooper. They had actually worked together. But now, Leidick was going to have to investigate her colleague Kevin, because he's one of the suspects, which was obviously very touchy, especially amongst cops. And so what Leidick wanted to do was gather more information, before she spoke to Michelle and Kevin. First, what she wanted to do was rule the Uses out as suspects, and she wanted to also get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Leidick looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. And Leidick began by asking them what the deal was with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John that was found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since about 9th grade, and she was planning to open a new bakery in town. And John had just loaned her $15,000 to help her out with that. But then sort of out of nowhere, he'd asked for the money back. Melissa said she'd been really disappointed when he did this, but she also knew John was in the middle of a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said that she had only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check. And so that's why she had also left that note for John along with the check, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she got that last $1,000 together. Leidick watched Melissa closely as she said all this. She did seem truly distraught over John's death, and that the money really didn't seem like a big issue to her at all relative to John's death. But for Leidick, the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question here. And she decided that she really just couldn't dance around it, even though Melissa was literally sitting next to her husband, Tom. Leidick looked right at Melissa and asked her straight out, was she having an affair with John? Melissa immediately flushed and said no, and she said they'd been close friends, but really nothing more. At this point, Leidick turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and just asked him the same thing. Was his wife having an affair with John? And for a second, Tom just went quiet, but then when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. And he basically refused to answer the question. And instead, he just kept repeating that he really had to go take care of his kids now. Now, Leidick knew this had been a very blunt thing to ask, but Tom's reaction to this question was really suspicious. And so by the time Leidick told Melissa and Tom that they could go, Tom had firmly established himself in Leidick's mind as a clear person of interest. Before Leidick left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers who she had sent to go observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular had been cut by glass. And John also had defensive wounds on his hands, as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he had at one point tried to run away. I mean, Leidick already knew this, but to hear the details from the autopsy just reinforced how truly brutal this murder was. And so what Leidick thought after hearing these details was, wow, whoever did this must have truly hated John. And Leidick's already thinking, I already have one suspect in Tom Use, whose wife might have been having an affair with John. Certainly that would be enough to inspire Tom to hate John. Despite Leidick's, obvious inexperience with murder cases, she felt really confident at this point that she'd be able to solve this, as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, like she always had on every case she'd worked in. However, the case was already getting a lot of attention in the news, and so Leidick knew there would be pressure to show results fast. If she moved too slowly, this case might either get taken away from her, or another police agency might get called in to help to speed it up. Now, Leidick didn't want that to happen, but she also really didn't want to compromise her methodical investigative process either, and so she figured she would have to strike a balance. That officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Leidick was supposed to send off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Leidick decided, now that she had these samples, that she was not going to do that. Leidick really wanted to keep her investigatory options open and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence in this case. And so after Leidick got these samples and after this officer had left, she went to the department refrigerator and put them in there, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, so 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Leidick had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members, and they'd painted John generally as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Leidick was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as Leidick arrived at John's office, she was glad she had decided to go there, because the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. And this was because during that long, multi-year fight John and Melissa had over their divorce, Michelle had at one point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family had not believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. And so John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She also called the office regularly to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. But actually, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to speak to her. And this detail definitely caught Leidick's ear. It was not just the, colleagues at the dental practice that said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said that. They said it was Michelle who wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. But John really had never felt comfortable with that, flashy lifestyle. And to many of John's friends and colleagues, it was that contrast between he and Michelle that ultimately sort of drove them apart. And so Leidick began to wonder, maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money a few days before his murder, where Michelle's calling, trying to demand money. John's not taking her call. Could that have been enough to inspire Michelle to murder John? Maybe. But also what Leidig discovered is that Michelle was actually listed as a beneficiary of John's life insurance plan. And so if John died, she stood to inherit literally millions of dollars. And so now there's like a twofold financial reason for Michelle to want to bring harm to John, basically all because of money. But it didn't seem possible that Michelle would be capable of overpowering John and delivering all those stab wounds and killing him. It just seemed like John would be able to fight her off if she was the killer. But Leidig thought, maybe Michelle hired somebody else to do it, somebody else that was much larger and more physical. She certainly had the money to do that. And so as Leidig left the dental office, she began to think about how she was actually going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidig did not want to make her move too soon without enough ammunition first. This was not just the first murder case she had worked. This was, the first murder case and the biggest case, period, that she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she didn't want to screw anything up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, so 6 days after the murder. And Corporal Leidig knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get pretty antsy about why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But, Leidig did understand where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure, just very public pressure to solve this thing right away. And so that was weighing on friends and family. And also, John himself, before he was killed, had this paranoia that he was going to be murdered. And now he's turned up dead. It just seemed like a crazy coincidence, or that John knew something, that this really was a prediction that came true. But Leidig also felt like John's friends and family just didn't understand why this was taking the time it was taking. She wasn't just being slow. She was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, Leidig had developed a very, careful method of her own. And for the next several months, Leidig continued to follow her protocol. And she did take her time, but again, with intention. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Leidig's suspects. And so for now, Leidig was really relying heavily on interviews. And Leidig, she would run down every single tip and rumor that she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her three best suspects, Tom Hughes, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's own family about, her failure to solve this case more quickly did get to her, but she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Hughes, so John's alleged affair partner and next-door neighbor, hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, so about 3 months after the murder, when Leidig got a call from Melissa. Leidig had actually been pretty surprised to hear from her, and then even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. And then when Leidig showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with these two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said that she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about the case. And Leidig was really not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter John's house. But Leidig also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics contacted by one of the suspects' wives, then that was what Leidig was going to do. And so Leidig followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and began saying they felt hot and cold patches, and, Leidig is doing her best not to roll her eyes. And then when they went into the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder and so was still splattered with blood, the psychic sisters had a premonition that told them the killing had happened in the dining room area. And then the psychic said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and they said the killer drove a black or red car, and that the killer was not Melissa Yuce's husband, Tom. Now, Melissa, as she listened to the psychic speak, she seemed really excited by this, but Leidig thought it was all ridiculous. The blood that they were literally looking at inside the home made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things the psychics were saying were easy to learn before showing up here. These are not revelations. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had brought here and hired, were now exonerating Melissa's husband was not very convincing. And so as the group finally left the house, the only thing Leidig thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But what they didn't know is she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, so 10 months after the murder. And at this point, Corporal Leidig finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation. Leidig's cooperation with those psychics had bought her a little time, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Yuce had gotten more and more agitated by Leidig's very slow pace. They felt like the psychics had basically given them as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed, which meant Leidig was losing her case. And on the one hand, this was quite literally the exact thing that Leidig had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency that Leidig had expected. And so now, even though this definitely stung, Leidig realized that she could actually finally make that play she'd been sitting on for almost a year. And so Leidig went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out that little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick that her officer had brought to her after John's autopsy. She had been told she needed to send these samples off to the state police crime lab pretty much right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, Leidig had decided to not do that and instead put these samples in the fridge and wait. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case way more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidig to send these samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a higher rung on the hierarchy. Now, normally the FBI would never take samples from sort of a small town murder case, but now that it was this huge public case, national news, Leidig knew she could take advantage. So she repackaged those fingernail clippings and the other samples, and she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back in, Leidig was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading, because her strategy of intentionally slow playing this investigation and sitting on this evidence until right now had totally paid off. Finally, Leidig on her computer was looking at the name of John's killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early morning hours of April 13th, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer climbed out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching, but it was dark and silent. So, the killer left the street and walked around to the back of this home and then slipped inside of it through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they walked right up to John, and they raised the blade up and then brought it down directly onto John. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming, and he put his hands up to try to protect himself, and he even tried clawing at the killer, getting the killer's skin under his fingernails. And so John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. John eventually got up and sort of began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down, and the two began to wrestle. And as they're struggling and the killer is stabbing John, John's flailing his arms around, and he eventually hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, throwing them everywhere. And then eventually, somehow, just on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. John eventually did make it to the front foyer, and he actually reached for the front door, but the killer actually shoved John as he did that, and John went flying towards that pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head went through the glass, and when his head went through, some of the glass severed his jugular, and then John bled to death right there. The killer watched until John was totally still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood right back out the door. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because the killer knew people trusted them with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. And the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Leidick had decided not to send all of that evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Leidick knew Kevin, and she liked him, and she basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Kevin seemed to hate John, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin ultimately believed them. And so Leidick had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer, and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Kevin was guilty here, well, she couldn't really trust the State Police Crime Lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would get involved, find out, and he would cover it up. It just was too risky, and so she didn't want to send the evidence to the State Crime Lab. So Leidick had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she'd kept the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time, until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case, and Leidick then got access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists did finally test the DNA that was found under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. And so in the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never actually charged in connection with the case.
Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.